подсветка какая-то больше, да,
No,
идет?
no. Okay, so it's on.
Ну, отлично.
Ilya,
Владимир,
it was a pleasure meeting you finally.
likewise, likewise.
So the purpose, I mean, first of all, the reason that I found your name is because at some point I kind of churned up search for former Soviet citizens, keywords, and your name popped up.
Interesting.
Not only
Okay.
did that happen,
Ага.
but I learned that you actually do give lectures where you share your views, as far as I understand, about evils of socialism. And the problem with socialism today, as we know, based to the latest statistics, that some 60% of youngsters ages 18 through 35, for whatever reason, think that socialism might be a viable alternative to capitalism. So how about if, we tell those youngsters precisely what socialism with the ISM in the end actually means? How does that differ from social programs, which probably something that you have in mind when you use the word socialism? That's my question.
I understand. I understand. I'm just trying to process the information, process the question. You know what? In many ways, I feel that socialism is something that actually needs to be experienced. And how often do you hear that when you try to describe the horrors of the socialism, people say, "Oh no, 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 no! We don't want that or socialism. We don't want the socialism that is prevalent somewhere in Sweden or Norway or Denmark, right?" Without not understanding that actually that is not the socialism which we are trying to talk about. That's what we try to warn about. That is a socialism where is country chose to heavily subsidize by their productive side of the population that is trying to subsidize that side of the society.
So, in other words, the socialism that these youngsters have in mind has absolutely nothing to do with the socialism as soon as they add ISM at the end. Because what you're talking about, and what we understand obviously, is that the Scandinavian paradise, which is not actually a paradise, I think, to all the Scandinavian countries, their standard of living is so much lower than that of the United States. But regardless, the system that they have over there is a capitalist system with probably the most strictly enforced private property laws than in any country in the world.
I agree.
And it has absolutely nothing, zero to do with socialism, again, with the ISM at the end. It has everything to do with the social programs.
Absolutely.
And what's the price that they're paying for it?
Absolutely, and well, there are many prices. Is one of them is you can think of how much invention and how much progress, how much anything productive comes out of those countries, as opposed to countries which are focused on the free markets, like the United States of America. Right?
Yeah, but actually, what I meant to say is that the price that they're paying is extremely high taxes. Like in France, they're
Correct.
proposed to pay like up to 75%. I mean,
Correct.
think about 75% in taxes. Then VAT. I mean, many Americans don't even understand what VAT stands for, value-added tax, because this is
Value-added tax.
probably the only, if not the only country in the world that does not have value-added tax. Yes, we have sales taxes that vary dramatically from state to state, from county to county, city to city, but we simply do not have value-added tax. And the highest one that we have, and that's in New York City, is less than 9%. And
That
the
is correct.
value-added tax in those socially funded programs in Scandinavia, which is 25%, and that's the highest in the world.
Absolutely.
So that's the price that everybody's paying for the so-called social welfare.
And that the choice that their society made, right? As it Margaret Thatcher once said, the socialism is great until it runs out of other people's money.
Exactly. But now that we got to the point of socialism, I mean, what unites us, and again, that's the reason why I wanted to meet with you and talk about, is the fact that we are the ones who witnessed the real socialism. Because all these people that say, oh, the country that we came from, like USSR in our case, or Cuba, or North Korea, or the Eastern Europe occupied by the Soviet Union, oh, that wasn't real socialism. You know, the socialism that we're gonna build is gonna be somewhat different. So how about if we talk about socialism, the real socialism, and actually the only socialism when implemented in reality, not written in some fancy books or philosophies? What does it look like? I mean, starting with, let's say, I mean, your childhood.
Vladimir, you know what? Actually, I would say that socialism in the Soviet Union actually was built as designed. Uh, it could not turn out any other way than it did. Um, so socialism of my childhood, I caught the tail years of the socialism when I was growing up in early 80s, right? Where, for example, the majority of the population, what Americans do not understand is that the majority of the population is 95% of the population lives significantly more. Just have to correct my thoughts.
Well, actually, what I meant to ask you is sort of your experience as a kid. I mean, starting with poor parents. I was born, let's say, near Vladivostok. I mean, the reality of the life of my parents dealing with me as a child was there were no Pampers. I mean, imagine living in the minus 40 Celsius, and at that point, basically Fahrenheit Celsius, they merged. It's so cold, it's almost the same. That makes no difference. So, no Pampers. So they had to wash these swaddling
Yes,
sheets,
of
whatever
course.
it's called, in water, cold water, or maybe they will boil water in some sort of a pot. Then they will string them outside in the street. In minutes, they will turn extremely hard, frozen hard. Then these kind of recollections. Do you have like how did you no toilet paper? I mean, these are the realities of living in the USSR.
So exactly the same thing as my experiences, right? And when I think about, for example, apartments where multiple generations of people used to live. Take, for example, my family. Well, when I was born, it was three of us was living in a tiny apartment on one of these old Khrushchevka buildings on the fifth floor. So elevator, of course, right? And then when our living conditions just improved a little bit, I had to live with another generation, with grandparents, parents, and myself, all living in the same small apartment by American standards, it was tiny. And we lived like this, and pretty much all until I left the Soviet Union.
Speaking of apartments, so one of the things that many people around the world do not understand, and it's probably the system that existed in the USSR and maybe in a few handful of so-called socialists. Of course, we don't call them socialists; we call them totalitarian countries. Existed a thing such as propiska.
Yes, of course.
So propiska means registration, local registration
Right.
at the place of where you live. So before you even get this registration, as far as apartments are concerned, how did your parents, how did they get their apartment in the first place? Do you know?
Well, looking back, how anybody in the Soviet Union would get an apartment, right?
Exactly.
You have to get enter in a long line, right, somewhere, usually to the place of your work, right?
Employment,
And
yes.
for the employment, right? And then you wait for 10, 12, 15 years. Sometimes the living conditions of your family change significantly, that you, while you're waiting that apartment to be granted to you. What's interesting, what many people on the West, and even in people, younger people who were born in Russia, Soviet Union, don't realize that in Soviet Union you were not really entitled to a free apartment. What you were entitled is to a certain amount of square footage.
Which
Right?
is, I think, was 7.5, if I'm not
It
mistaken.
it
the
was
person.
something around 9. I think it's
9?
square meters.
Square meters,
Square
yeah.
meters. So it's a small amount. What is the fundamental difference? The fundamental difference is the following: if your family got got an apartment, let's say you have three room apartment where your grandma lives, your father, mother, younger child. Let's say grandma passed away.
Yeah, let me interrupt you for a second because it sounds like a little bit too easy. Oh, you get an apartment as if it's like you uh, uh, snap your fingers and the apartment becomes available. I mean, the key is, like you said, that the apartments are granted by the place of your employment. Okay, the waiting list stretches decades. I mean, literally decades.
Correct.
So why why is there this system like that? I mean, in my mind, that's basically to enslave you and make you work for a certain plant, factory, research institute, or whatever for decades. I mean, you're really stuck in a certain place.
It's a very good point. You are tied to the benefits. That is correct. I think the issue is dual. First, it's the willingness of the state to maintain a system like this and do make you dependent, tie you to a specific place where you cannot freely move from one place to another, right? And second thing, it's ability of the state to supply those apartments to begin with, right?
Yeah, so the key is the apartment that you live in, even after this long wait, after you get it, it still doesn't belong to you.
No.
It belongs to the state,
Absolutely, and that's
to
what
the government.
That's you're absolutely right, and that's exactly what I was trying to emphasize. Is that apartment is not yours. You are entitled to a certain square footage in this apartment. Government is at their full right. If your family got smaller, for because of the death of one of your family members, government is in a full right to bring someone else from outside to occupy that empty room.
Can
The
you imagine that?
apartment. Imagine that, right? And that's what many, even Russians, do not understand. That's how the system works. So apartment could not be sold, right? We know that apartments
No.
could not be sold.
It didn't belong to you, so how can you sell something that does not belong to you?
They could not be. They only could be at best. They only could be exchanged.
Exchanged.
Right. So
Oh
that's
my
you
God.
remember that's called black market business.
I remember that. I remember all these advertisements in
Yes.
newspapers. Let's say I live in Moscow and I have a
Right.
3-room apartment. Okay, I want to exchange it into 1-room apartment, let's say in St. Petersburg, and a 2-room in
Apartment elsewhere,
Sochi
but
or whatever.
That is exactly right. That's
And
exactly
it
right.
was a nightmare.
And honestly, how legitimate was a lot of that business? That's a big question because, as you and I know very well, there is no private business of any kind in the Soviet Union, right?
That's right. That's a good point. I mean,
So-
people don't understand that everything, I mean, absolutely everything, your entire life, all your possessions except personal property belong to the government. I mean, everything. Yes, you
Absolutely
were
right.
entitled to some personal possessions, and personal as opposed uh, to not personal possessions are the ones that
Just give me a few minutes, okay? Gotta go to
no,
sleep.
we can take a break. if you like.
No,